Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. If you watch the Fox News channel, or if you're interested in news, or if you have the capacity for linear thought, you're probably familiar with Mollie Hemingway, one of the best and hardest-nosed reporters out there today. Mollie Hemingway has turned her attention and her vast aptitude for research on the last election, the 2020 presidential election. Here is, before we even, and we're going to speak to her in a second, before we even get there, she frames it so nicely in her new book. It's called Rigged, meteorically rising to the top of the bestseller list right now. But she frames the election this way, and I want this to frame our conversation. She writes this: rather than accept that Trump won and Clinton lost fair and square in 2016, the political and media establishments desperately sought to explain away Trump's victory. You can run the best campaign, you can even become the nominee, and you can have the election stolen from you, Hillary Clinton told her followers in 2019. It was all nonsense, writes Mollie Hemingway. Even Robert Mueller, who ran a multi-year and multi-million-dollar government investigation into claims that Trump personally colluded with Russian President Vladimir Putin to steal the election from Clinton, found no evidence to support the fevered accusations. And then 2020 happened. At the drop of a hat, America's electoral system went from irredeemably corrupt and broken in 2016 to unquestionably safe in 2020. But was our electoral system unquestionably safe in 2020? That's the subject of Mollie Hemingway's new book, and we are honored to have her join us in studio today. Mollie Hemingway, thanks so much for coming on.
Great to be here.
Let me torture you before we get to your book. Now, our viewers have seen a ton of you. They love you. They have good reason for that. Probably don't know too much about you. You're not the kind of person who talks about herself, ever. I've never heard you mention yourself in any way. And I can see by the pained look on your face, you don't really want to start now, but I'm going to push you. And just ask you, like, where are you from, and how did a nice person like you wind up in this business?
I'm not entirely sure how I ended up in journalism, but I grew up out west. My dad's a pastor. My mom's a teacher. So we lived in Wyoming, California, Colorado. And definitely being from out west shaped my thinking. Also being a pastor's kid shaped my thinking.
Not from Jackson, Wyoming, I assume.
No, Kemmerer, lovely Kemmerer, Wyoming.
Yes.
And I actually love Wyoming. It's a great place.
Yes.
And has about my favored level of population.
Yep.
Not many.
Not many.
And but California also, I grew up in the Central Valley. It's a wonderful,
Where?
in Tulare County.
Yeah.
So I thought it was great. I had no idea that that was considered the armpit of California.
By coastal
great.
Californians, yes, that is reviled. That's where all the food comes from. They don't want to know anything else about it.
But like even that, I loved learning, even though my family wasn't involved in that, just learning how orchards operate and seeing where the food comes from. I wish my own kids could have that kind of knowledge.
Me too.
And that they could smell the orange blossoms. Like.
So you grew up in the Central Valley, in Wyoming, Kemmerer, Wyoming, and then in Colorado, which is not all crazy people. Even now it's not. And somehow you wind up in journalism in Washington. That doesn't seem like an obvious path.
Yeah, I thought I wanted to be an economist, and that's what I studied. And I came out to D.C. to pursue that, and then quickly realized that academia was not for me, although I now work at a college, too. At Hillsdale I teach. But I kind of fumbled around with that for a little bit, but all of my friends were in journalism, and they just seemed to really enjoy their lives. They made no money, but they really seemed to enjoy what they were doing. And I just found that intriguing, and then after 9/11, I got more interested in world affairs and religion, and decided I wanted to write at that point.
And then you married a journalist.
That's the guy who actually kind of convinced me that it was good. He really,
That was the gateway drug?
Yeah. But, and he kind of taught me how to do it, because I was more of a math person, and he explained to me how to write and what you're trying to include.
We don't get a lot of math people in our business.
I've noticed that. Oh, in fact, I got a job in journalism where the fact that I didn't have a degree in journalism was a mark against me. And we would have to cover federal budgets, and then nobody knew how to read a budget. Nobody had had any experience in regression analysis or anything like that. I thought you guys should actually not disadvantage people who don't have journalism degrees and hire some people with econ degrees. But
you mean a journalism degree doesn't teach you how to work with numbers?
They have, my husband, who does have a journalism degree, told me that they had classes like math for journalism people, which was very basic, rudimentary understanding of it. Yeah.
So you get to D.C. So you've been in D.C. about 20 years then. How's it changed in that time?
I actually am kind of pleased with how it's changed during that time in some ways. It seemed like for a long time everything was just very stagnant on all sides. People were very much expecting that if you were on one side of the aisle, you would be on this check, you would be able to check off what you believed on certain things.
Yes.
And in recent years, there's been all this explosion of interesting different policy approaches, this idea that maybe things don't have to be the same way. Obviously, DC reacted horribly to that revelation, and they flipped out over the last 5 years, and they're very comfortable right now because things are back to the way that they were. But I think we all kind of saw it. It doesn't have to be this way. We could do things differently. We could reevaluate different policy approaches, and I find that wonderful, particularly on foreign policy and economic policy.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. This is not the topic of your book, which we'll get to in just a second, but I'm interested. So you basically describe how the last election was rigged in a macro sense. It was not a free and fair election of the kind that we were promised. I know some people on the traditional left who agree with you and who say so out loud. I don't mean the lifestyle liberals who live in your neighborhood in Washington, but I mean I think Glenn Greenwald would substantively agree with this. That's a change.
It is, although you look at how people have evaluated elections internationally,
yes.
and they've always had ideas about things like you have to be in a free and fair media state. You can't be in a propaganda state. Right. I don't think anybody would look at our current media environment and think that we're at our best when it comes to actually receiving news as opposed to misinformation. Or they would say that you can't have a lot of censorship going on in your political environment. We have nothing but censorship going on. So those things alone would affect the integrity of an election by international observers, but also changing election laws in the middle of an election, doing it on a wide scale, to decrease the integrity of the type of voting you're having. So we changed everything to have tens of millions of mail-in ballots at the same time that we dropped the standards for evaluating whether those ballots are secure. And that's to say nothing of the other issues with Mark Zuckerberg engaging in a private takeover. When tech oligarchs or any oligarch controls the outcome of an election, that's not good for the security or integrity either.
Okay, so you just outlined our conversation. So let's hit these three. Okay, these three factors that really weren't publicly discussed very much before or immediately after the last election, and maybe that's our fourth topic. Like, why didn't anyone note this stuff until your book came out? But let's go in order. So there's the media landscape, which you just described as primarily censorious, changing election law, and then the influence of outside groups funded by billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg and Pierre Omidyar. Let's start with the media. Tell us about the media landscape in 2020.
Well, we've had a media that everyone acknowledges is biased for a long time.
Right.
You have like Dwight Eisenhower complaining about it, and Republicans kind of became familiar with it and almost accepted it. They almost acted as if they deserved this secondhand treatment from the media. Yes. And then when Trump comes on the scene and he doesn't play the game, like all the normal ways that they try to constrain him, calling him a racist or whatnot, and instead of changing his positions like a typical Republican would do, he doubles down and he keeps his position and calls them the fake news. So their response to that in 2016 is to go from mere bias into complete oppositional propaganda.
Yes.
They announced this on the front page of the New York Times. Jim Rutenberg has this great piece explaining it's time for us to throw off even pretending we have any norms of objectivity or standards that we'll hold to. It's all about fighting Trump. And so they do that for 4 years. And they mostly do that through this unbelievably ridiculous conspiracy theory. Like, I love the idea that in 2016, they do such a bad job of covering the campaign. All they do is tell people there's no way Trump can win. And when he does win, they don't say, oh, maybe we covered this inappropriately. They say, no, it wasn't us. It was the Russians who controlled the outcome. So they lean into this conspiracy theory that Donald Trump was a secret agent of Russia, that they colluded to steal the election. And they just are off to the races with fake news that it has no basis in fact.
Do they
for
believe
years.
it, do you think?
I've actually wondered that, like, what is the best possible outcome? Either they're so stupid that they really did believe that this was a reasonable assessment of things, or they're mendacious, or maybe both. Maybe there's a combination.
Right, stupid and dishonest.
But you just get years of false information, so that anything that's good, like a good thing that's happening in the administration, gets downplayed, tons of anonymous sources who are refuted by on-the-record sources or other independent things that you can check, like the Ein Marn story. I don't know if you remember that during the campaign. It was actually a quite big story where The Atlantic puts out this claim that they have anonymous sources saying that Donald Trump had disparaged dead American soldiers. And like, say what you want about
in the 2020 election.
Yeah. In the 2020.
Of course. Yeah, that they were suckers who died in the First World War.
Right. And Donald Trump has a lot of issues, but
Right.
he kind of is known for enjoying the pomp and circumstance of military ceremonies. You had on the record, like more than 20 on the record folks refuting what these people had claimed. They said that he had claimed that he couldn't visit the cemetery because of weather, but really it was because of this secret hatred of dead American Marines and soldiers. And you had contemporaneous weather reports refuting it. You had John Bolton, who hates Donald Trump, saying, I was in the room, that's not true. And yet it seemed to be no barrier to the story spreading.
But I also love the fact, it's just like, from my perspective as someone who thinks the First World War was the worst thing that ever happened in human history, it was a wholly pointless war that built nothing, it only destroyed, paved the way for Nazism, accelerated Bolshevism. It was like a total disaster. No one got anything out of it. People died totally pointlessly. Like, the media all of a sudden, like, defending the honor of the First World War. I mean, isn't this also like this thing you notice where Trump calls Haiti a shithole country, which it absolutely is. That's why Haitians want to leave. And all of a sudden the media are like defending Haiti's standard of living. It's like they'll defend anything he attacks.
Yeah, and that happened over and over
Yes!
and over again. So that type of media environment does not let people have good information. I mean, the other thing about that Ein Marn story is it comes out at around the same time that you're having another one of these brokered peace agreements between Israel and a foreign country, which was really big news. You might remember in 2016, the media said that if Donald Trump were elected, we would have nuclear annihilation. And instead of that, he has this foreign policy that's very much a return to sort of traditional Reagan and pre-Reagan Republican foreign policy, strong national defense, but restrained for the most part. And rather than cover that story, and that's a really important story, that's one of the most important things that a commander-in-chief does, they're off on these anonymously sourced, ridiculous stories that affect, and even in debates, what gets mentioned? Does his foreign policy get mentioned? No, even though there was supposed to be a presidential debate focused on foreign policy. Instead, questions are asked about Ein Marn.
So, the censorship. I mean, it does seem there's a difference between a media that is dishonest and that lies and a media that prevents honest people from telling the truth.
It might be two sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah,
it might just be
I suppose it is.
Everything is justified in service of the political outcome, and so both of those things are necessary. You have to suppress information that you think is helpful. You have to make up information that you think will hurt your political opponents, but you also have to censor dramatically anything that hurts your political ally. And I couldn't believe. I thought that what happened with the Joe Biden, Hunter Biden laptop story was maybe the worst thing we've ever seen in contemporary journalism. There was no justification for how they handled that story. And everyone just kind of knew what their job was. The moment that story came out, they all decided that they would suppress and censor the information, and they all went about doing it. The idea that the American people don't have a right to know about the family business of the man that they might elect president is just absurd. Of course, we have a right to know what's going on there, particularly when the family business seems to be that you give money to members of the Biden family in exchange for things we're not quite sure.
Or changing American foreign policy because the Bidens got paid?
I mean, presumably that's what the interest is and why these foreign oligarchs are doing that. This should have been a story that everybody was covering throughout the entire campaign. Instead, they don't cover it, and when it kind of comes out anyway because of some lonely independent journalists there at the New York Post, they decide they have to suppress it. That's it's horrific.
Was there anybody, I'm trying to remember, that was such an intense moment. Was there anybody in traditional media, legacy media, corporate media, who said, well, wait a second, you can't censor this stuff? Did anybody stand up?
I remember there was someone at Politico, I can't remember who it was, who tweeted out something about, like, this is legitimate news.
Yes,
but then he was forced to apologize, like in a struggle session somehow.
But I just looked at, I've been in TV my whole life. I know all the anchors. And I looked at people who are, not thoroughly dishonest. They're liberal, but they're not thoroughly dishonest. I'm not going to name their names because I've worked with them in the past. But like on CNN, for example, why the hell are they staying silent in the face of that? Like, what do you think? What do they think? Is that okay now?
Yeah, and I wonder too. I mean, when you talked to them or when people would write about why they were suppressing it, it was all based on this idea that telling the truth about this would somehow be disinformation, which is this weird world we're in now where if you are honest about things, that gets coded as disinformation. You go back to 2016 and you look at how the tech oligarchs responded to Trump winning. They knew that the media had behaved in such a way as to suppress the Donald Trump campaign, and they felt like they were guilty because they had allowed him to communicate freely with the American people, and that the American people had found that to be interesting enough to elect him as president. And they say, we'll never let this happen again. But the media also decide, well, we somehow didn't do enough to control the outcome of the 2016 election because we failed, so we have to do even more. And they just decide at the outset that any story that hurts their favorite candidate is disinformation. That's what they decide.
Russian, in this case.
And yeah, they get specific into that.
So if that had happened in Russia, if Putin had done what Facebook, Twitter, Google, CNN, MSNBC, The Atlantic, The New York Times, The LA Times, Chicago Tribune, I mean, our whole media landscape, and NBC News, if Putin had done that, would election observers have considered that a free and fair election?
We ourselves, our State Department, would view this type of thing as evidence of lack of a free election or fair election. Actually, wasn't it just a couple months ago Russians had some kind of elections where the results of the election were kind of slowed down over the course of days, and our State Department put out a note saying that that was very suspicious. I was like, okay, so it's suspicious if Russia does it, but if we do it, that's not a problem at all, that we don't have results right away. But yeah, it's... Or even think about how the entire Mueller probe was based on the fact that Russia, a country that has presumably been meddling in our elections for 100 years, although they curiously, thankfully, stopped in 2018 and 2020. Wasn't that a miracle? But that they've been doing that for 100 years, and then in the 2016 election, they did this by spending like $100,000 in Facebook ads, some of which benefited Hillary Clinton, some of which benefited Donald Trump. And so we have this massive investigation that ends up showing that no Americans colluded on this. But what would that say about all the meddling from these tech companies and media companies, the suppressing of information, the manipulation of search algorithms, or deplatforming voices that they find to be detrimental to their political cause? That is worth so much more than $100,000 in Russian Facebook ads.
So you live in D.C., so you know, without getting too specific, I mean, I can think of a couple of other countries that constantly meddle in our policies and in our elections. And our media, for that matter. I mean constantly. And everyone who lives there knows that. Spy on us, pay off politicians. No one ever mentioned. It's like, I'm watching this on TV and I'm thinking, you all live there, you know what's actually happening, and you're all lying about it. Does that ever make you feel dizzy?
Well, not just that this is what everybody does. I mean, it's kind of a country should...
but not Russia. I'm talking about countries that are not Russia.
Any country that has its interests is going to be doing this in all sorts of other countries. But so they focus only on Russia. And then the moment that the 2020 election happens, all of a sudden that all goes away. And all of these things that President Biden is doing, if President Trump had done, would have been evidence of their collusion, whether it's the pipeline through Germany or suppressing our own energy production, all these things that would have been maybe mentioned in impeachment articles if they were the previous president, don't get mentioned at all. And also, none of the other countries who are involved in these things are mentioned at all. You look at China, which has so much to do, they do a great job of co-opting former politicians.
Yeah.
The entire former government in Great Britain is, all
Madeleine Albright got rich from Russia.
And so you have all these other countries that are involved in it, and we just don't pay any attention to it. So I don't know, it just seems very disingenuous that we pretended that this Russian thing was somehow unique or out of the norm or worthy of derailing the entire country over or risking, I don't know. I mean, just the fact that they're a nuclear superpower, and you would think responsible people would say, we should be careful in how we talk about this because they are a nuclear country. No, they didn't care about it.
They don't care. So our social media companies, while they're obviously loathsome and corrupt, really are pivotal in any kind of election, right? So if they're willing to outright suppress, to censor accurate information in order to help a political candidate, how can any Republican ever get elected nationally again with these companies in charge?
So I think it's important to remember that in 2020, there was a great deal of tech meddling, and they are making plans to have even more. We've already seen that in the last year, but that it's still a pretty close election. Like 2020 comes down to 43,000 votes across 3 states. And that was with these tech companies pulling out all the stops. It is kind of interesting to me that Facebook did so much, not just at a corporate level, but also personally. Mark Zuckerberg did so much to control the outcome of the election. And Democrats are responding by bullying him into greater levels of censorship. It's kind of interesting that both of those entities have a lot of power, and they're trying to work them against each other. But yeah, it absolutely needs, it's an issue that has to be tackled, and it has to be tackled at multiple levels. I don't even really know what the precise answer is, but people need to understand that they are a negative influence on our political life. They're actually kind of a threat to the continuation of the country because of the level of meddling that they're doing. And it's a dire situation. I hope that people who are smart and thinking about tech policy are doing more, again, than these like empty comments about how there's nothing that can be done because they're a private company.
Yeah, build your own Google.
Yeah.
Okay, so we could go on forever about the media landscape, and both of us would get madder, and our audience would, of course, nod because they already know all this. Changing the way we vote, which we did. Give us the overview of what that looked like in 2020.
So people have been fighting about the way we vote since before we were a country. We've had a lot of changes in the way people vote. It used to be that you would go down in front of a judge and publicly say who you're voting for town council, but that people who owed money to other people could have their vote manipulated because it was so public. So we sort of slowly moved to secret ballot. We also used to have elections on different days throughout the country, and that causes problems in some presidential elections because the way the early states are voting affects how other states. Also, people are moving between states to vote in multiple elections. And so we moved to one day, secret ballot, and we kind of stick there for quite some time. But then we move a few decades ago into opening up to mail-in balloting or absentee voting. We've always had some form of absentee voting for people who are away at war or other legitimate reasons. We start just massively expanding it. And Democrats have, for a long time, wanted to move toward more mail-in voting. They have some problems with enthusiasm on Election Day sometimes, and so they decide that if they can move to mail-in voting, they can kind of get rid of that enthusiasm gap. They can put their army of, public employee or union types out to make sure that everybody who's on their records is voting. They can harvest ballots. They can do other things associated with mail-in balloting. And so they're just pushing for these changes over a long period of time. In the 2020 election, they actually had wanted it long before the 2020 year starts. Once COVID happens, though, it's the perfect excuse to just dramatically change the way we vote, to flood the system with tens of millions of mail-in ballots. They get some people to actually agree to just mail ballots to everybody who's on the roll, which is interesting because like 10% of the population moves each year without changing their, they might go register to vote in their new state or somewhere else, but they stay on the rolls in the old state. And so all of these changes happen. Some of them are legal, some of them are illegal. The Constitution requires that all such changes be made by the state legislature, but you start seeing a lot of these changes happening from other officials or from courts agreeing to make changes that the state legislature didn't agree to. And so it's just this chaos and intentional chaos. It's actually part of the Democrat strategy. And I just want to say that one of the other things I thought was so interesting when I was researching this, I'd done a lot to cover the Russia collusion lie. I had covered that for years. And one of the key figures in that was a guy named Mark Elias. He's a Democrat super attorney. He used to work at Perkins Coie, which is one of these big, powerful Democrat law firms. He's the guy who hired the people who invented the Russia collusion lie. And he's also the guy who coordinated and ran the operation to change all of the voting laws in every state. And so, yes, sometimes he would lobby state legislatures to change, but sometimes he would do something called sue and settle. He would sue a friendly Secretary of State or election commission, and then they would settle by agreeing to his list of demands to lower the scrutiny for mail-in ballots. And it was a really effective strategy.
Why would you want to lower the scrutiny for a mail-in ballot?
So one of the problems with mail-in balloting is because it doesn't take place in an election facility where you have oversight, is people frequently don't fill out their ballot correctly. And the law the law tries to say, okay, we're going to let you do mail-in balloting, but we'll try to replicate in some fashion what happens in a voting booth. And so there's like a secrecy envelope that some people have. There's a testament that you have to sign that you weren't coerced, the type of thing you might sign or that people might be able to observe for themselves. If you're going into a voting booth, they can tell if you've brought someone else in there with you, with a gun to your head.
Yeah.
And so you sign something, you date it to make sure that you are, where you said you were. It's kind of a legal document. And the best case construction on this is that people mess up all of these procedures, that they intend to follow the law, but they forget to sign or date or not have someone else bullying them with what they say. By lowering the standard, and so a lot of mail-in ballots get tossed because there are all sorts of problems that can be brought into the process by it being done through the mail and in the privacy of homes. And so the Democrats didn't want all of those ballots tossed because there used to be like a fairly significant percentage of ballots that are tossed because they failed to adhere to the law. And so they changed all of these rules so that even if you don't have a signature that matches, or even if you don't have appropriate identification of who you are, that your ballot will still be counted. And a lot of people look at this and go, this is the whole reason why we had these measures here, was to make sure that there wouldn't be problems with these ballots. And the Democrats say, oh, but these are real voters. They intended to vote, so we can't disenfranchise them. But of course, making people who vote in person follow the law and be who they say they are, but not having those same requirements for the other methods of voting, actually disenfranchises the legal in-person voters.
Well, of course it does. Is there any way to ensure that mail-in balloting is legitimate?
So we've always kind of known that mail-in balloting is ripe for fraud. This is something we all used to admit, whether we were the New York Times or Washington Post or Jimmy Carter or the country of France, which banned mail-in balloting in the 70s because of problems with fraud. We all used to acknowledge that it was ripe for fraud. That doesn't mean everybody who votes by mail is committing fraud or that they're all suspicious,
right.
But it just creates greater opportunities. There's so much less oversight. But there are things you can do, namely first of all, there's an idea that you should privilege in-person voting in a way that you don't privilege other forms of voting. Like the Constitution in Wisconsin says you have a right to vote or not vote. I like how they put that because people act like you only have a right to vote but not vote. They say absentee balloting is a privilege. And I think that's an okay way to look at it, that we might want to have a means by which people can vote by other means. Maybe that's early voting in person. Maybe that's mail-in voting. But certain states have been able to accomplish a rigor associated with mail-in balloting by having voter ID and making sure that each ballot is tied to a particular voter ID and having a system that's able to be checking that without having all of the flaws that were present in the 2020 election.
Right. And that's kind of the point, that this all happened in the months preceding that election. No one seemed to be slowing it down or even trying. Am I misremembering this?
No, and like the states that do have universal mail-in balloting, it took them a long period of time to get it to a place where people could trust the operation. That was not what we were doing in 2020.
So if all of a sudden Nancy Pelosi stands up in the months before a presidential election that she's bet everything on, and says we have to completely change the way we voted for the past 250 years. We have to do it right now, and we're going to do it. If you're the Republican campaign, you've got to know you're being screwed in real time.
Okay,
right?
So
I mean, that's what I thought as I watched it. I don't know why they're doing this, but I know it's because it helps them.
There were people who thought that everything sounded fishy with the changes that were being made. It is also good to remember what we were going through at that period in time. Like, people really were freaked out about coronavirus. You're having elections taking place in March and April and May and June, where you are getting the idea that people are, some governors are actually changing the election date or moving their primaries or general elections. It really was a chaotic time. So while Republicans are suspicious at this point in time, and they're beginning to get a handle of something that Democrats are definitely getting a handle of, which is there's a huge partisan divide on mail-in balloting. Democrats, for some reason, feel pretty comfortable with it. Republicans, for some reason, are far less likely to engage in it. And so this is the divide that gets exploited throughout 2020.
How big is that divide?
I mean, the RNC was actually polling people in different states to see what their attitudes were. And I think it was Georgia, where 80% of the Republicans said they would not vote by mail. This is not an issue that they have in the Democrat Party. In fact,
Wow.
Wisconsin, they moved to expand mail-in balloting, and the New York Times writes up how this is like a huge coup for the Democrats because Democrats like mail-in balloting, and they start intentionally pushing it, dropping the scrutiny. In Wisconsin, one of the changes they allow, 2 Democratic county commissioners allow people to register to vote without showing ID, so long as they say they're indefinitely confined. And tens of thousands of people do this. I mean, that's an election that came down to, 20,000 votes in the end. So Democrats were just savvy. They were smart. They exploited the global pandemic. And Republicans have this tendency, to maybe to their credit even, to be more law and order type. So they're following the law. They're following what the rules are, and then
They're very obedient. How much voter fraud was there, do you think?
So one of the things about the changes to election law is that they were designed to make it even harder to detect fraud, particularly to conclusively determine fraud that was there. I think people use the term fraud to describe anything wrong that happens in an election, but it's actually a pretty particular meaning. It's not, so you could even be an illegal voter but not necessarily have committed fraud. So in Georgia, for instance, if you move from one county to another, you're required to re-register to vote in the new county. And if you don't, you're an illegal voter. But there's a way you could understand people voting under their old registration as being illegal, and it is illegal, but not fraudulent.
Right, because you're not intentionally misrepresenting yourself.
Exactly. And so, but the whole point of the changes is to expand the sphere of litigation so that depending on a race, if you're ahead or you're behind, your co-partisans can sue one way or the other. And so fraud becomes very difficult to conclusively find. It happens in every election. There's no question that it happened in an election where we massively expanded the opportunities for fraud. But that's different than conclusively determining exactly how much was there.
So this is an issue for anyone who has a cable show, because you're constantly bombarded with these claims. You want to be as responsible as you can, always tell the truth, never lie. Some of these claims seem serious, others don't seem serious, or they're confusing. Have you gotten close? What do you think the actual truth is about the fraud?
So I think one thing that was interesting about what happened after the election is people just sensed something was off.
Yes, that's right.
They could tell that there was enthusiasm for Trump that was just frankly not there for Biden. And then to be told that he gets this massively more votes for him than any other human in history, just kind of didn't feel right. And people immediately...
Yeah, I call bullshit on that. It's just that's totally right. That's exactly how I felt. Come on now.
Yeah, and so then people sort of start attaching themselves to fraud theories. Fraud is really difficult to detect even in a normal election. If you ever look at who's been convicted of fraud, it's usually a case that took years to build. Or, if you look at journalism, like New York Times and Washington Post have looked into fraud, it takes years to sort of find it in a way that's reportable. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't value in people sensing there was something wrong. I think the case I lay out in Rigged, which explains why everything felt weird in a way that is backed by facts, is a much more fruitful
I agree.
and prosecutable thing than to just be talking about things that kind of go
I
down
agree.
rabbit holes.
I strongly agree with that. I'm really grateful that you wrote this book, and I'm grateful you've come to talk about it. The very specific claims about voting machines. I talked to Mike Flynn's lawyer right after the election. And I really like Mike Flynn, and I take Mike Flynn seriously. And so I took his lawyer seriously, and she was making these claims. And I said to her, and I said this on TV, but I'm willing to believe anything. I believe in UFOs. So I am open-minded, the most open-minded person you ever got. I mean it. I am, too. So give me the evidence, and we'll just, we'll devote a whole week to it. And she was outraged that I asked for the evidence. So after that, I never got near that story again. I was so offended by her reaction and so spooked by it. If you make a claim, prove it. And she didn't. So, but I'm still, I guess, open-minded. What are we to make of that?
Well, so I think that one's particularly tricky, and it's so fascinating to look at this issue not in 2020. So in 2004, you might remember, voting machines were a huge issue for Democrats.
Yeah, I remember really well.
And they made a documentary called Hacking Democracy, which was all about how voting machines in Ohio had been manipulated. It's been a pet project for a lot of Democratic senators, actually, including Kamala Harris. They would hold hearings about the vulnerabilities of these voting machines.
Yes.
And
so I sort of buy that, actually.
And then also what's interesting, in 2020, there's a primary in Georgia that is done on these voting machines for the very first time. And the primary is a mess. And the way the New York Times and Politico write about it, they sound like this. They sound like these people on the right who are making these same claims after the 2020 election, that they were hacked, that they're vulnerable to foreign governments. And
is any of that, okay, well, just to sort of take the emotion out of it for our viewers, is there honestly any truth to the claims by the Democratic Party in 2004 in the primary you were just talking about that these voting machines were hacked or rigged?
So, in my view, I don't find those arguments terribly persuasive on either side. I think that there are problems with every election. There's also no question that voting machines are less secure than they should be.
Yes.
Okay? But that's different than saying that you have evidence that they were compromised. But the fact that they are compromisable is a legitimate issue. And that is something that people on both sides of the aisle should care about. If we have hacks, and we do all the time, cyber attacks on corporate entities, we should be caring more about these machines. But a lot of times machines have strengths that people don't have in terms of ability to count things quickly or to process information quickly. And so it's kind of there's a pro and a con with either.
Yeah, there's a trade-off.
So I don't want to completely dismiss it. They are vulnerable, but that's different than when I would look at what people were claiming about particular vulnerabilities. Like I said, I think the case I lay out about how we had a rigged election, how the outcome was determined by much more complex things. In a way, it would be kind of nice if it was just some foreign entity flipping a few switches.
Venezuela.
That's not what we had. We had a really coordinated, competent campaign to compromise the elections. But on the bright side, there are things you can do.
So just if I can sum up what I think you're saying, just to kind of put a bow on this and move past it, you think that electronic voting machines are vulnerable. Everyone who's honest about it acknowledges that. You don't see evidence of widespread corruption with these machines, but you're open to the idea that it could have happened, but you don't kind of conclude either way in this book and instead point to the bigger factors that rigged the election.
Exactly.
Okay, good. I'm sorry, this has been bothering me. Let me ask you, since we're getting to things that have been bothering us, what happened to Matt Drudge?
Oh.
Do you think, and I've talked to, I knew Matt Drudge, and haven't talked to him in a while, but I certainly knew him pretty well, and I've talked to a number of people who said, Matt Drudge was one of in the view of the left, one of the reasons that Trump won. He gave Trump early legitimacy on his site, which was a pivotal part of the media landscape at that time, and that Democrats decided to take it offline and they bought it.
So,
is that true?
I have no idea.
Okay.
But I will say one thing that I thought was interesting. I mentioned that I covered the Russia collusion lies. Now, that would have normally been Drudge bait.
Yeah.
And Matt Drudge, I don't know how involved he was with Drudge Report in recent years. He has editors who work for him. And I was talking to one of the editors. It's a guy I knew. And I was pointing out that they hadn't linked to any of my explosive reporting, kind of uncovering what we all now know is true, which is that was a total hoax. That was a lie. And he suggested to me that he hadn't really realized that they hadn't covered it and that he'd look into it. And they never linked to any of that.
Of course, I know exactly who you're talking about. And I've talked to him about it as well. He's a wonderful person, but I'm not sure he's being completely direct with us on this. But you don't know, bottom line, whether Drudge has been sold or whether that was the target of a Democratic takeover before the election.
Yeah. No idea.
I don't know either. For the record, I bet money that happened, but I don't know. Okay. So changes to the voting laws. Going forward, does this leave Republicans at a permanent disadvantage?
I think that there are good things that are happening right now. Like the level of interest in election integrity is where it should have been many years ago on the right.
Yes.
Left has really cared a lot about changing voting laws.
The mechanics of voting, they've always cared about that.
Yeah, and actually that relates to the really big issue, which is the Mark Zuckerberg private takeover of our government election offices. And he funds, government election offices, and then there are strings attached.
Well, so I'm going to get to that in 2 seconds. I just want you to finish it. I'm trying to, because there's so much in here, I just want to be systematic. But just the voting laws, I asked, does this leave Republicans at a permanent disadvantage? And you said, actually, there's an upside. We just explain what that is?
The situation is not great. The situation is not good in that there are all sorts of laws that were changed. Some of them were changed temporarily, but a lot of them were changed permanently in 2020 in ways that harm the security of the election. So people need to be focused on that, staying attentive to it, particularly in states where maybe the legislature isn't as concerned about it as they should be. Also, a lot of the changes that even Republican legislatures made were frankly paltry. Like, it blew me away that Georgia got all this pushback for their voter integrity law because it wasn't that great. Like, they put in some provisions to protect their system, but it wasn't that great.
Is it true that no African Americans have government ID?
That's like the racism of these people on all of these fronts. So things are bad, but people are much more aware, and they kind of understand the issues in play, particularly with being able to oversee mail-in ballot counting. And so I feel that things are better now than they were a couple years ago.
Okay. That's like you yourself, a very balanced and thoughtful response. Okay, now to Zuckerberg. So you came on our nighttime show very recently. All of us are kind of aware that Zuckerberg was throwing a ton of money at the election, or I was peripherally aware of it, but I didn't fully understand the scale of it. And I was really shocked by your description of what happened. If you could just give us the overview, and then we'll get into the details.
So when I was researching the book, by the way, I kind of knew what to expect with the media and tech and changes to election law. But when I got to that part about what Mark Zuckerberg did, I sounded almost, I sounded like one of these right-wingers who's all upset. I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy that this was allowed to happen. So he spends about as much money as the federal government does in running our 2020 elections. He gives $419 million to two left-wing groups who then funnel the money primarily to Democrat counties in swing states. So they focus the funding, like technically it can go to both Republican and Democrat counties, but Republican counties are getting $5,000. Democrat counties are literally getting like $10 million, like Philadelphia did. And the strings are attached with that funding that are mostly spent on staffing to enable this army of left-wing people to come in and handle everything from voter registration, targeting different groups for voter registration, designing ballots.
Wait, when you say come into the government apparatus that oversees elections?
So, we all expect billionaires to spend money privately on campaigns. They like to do that. This is not that.
On media.
Yeah, this is not that. This is the government election offices. So election offices are supposed to be nonpartisan. They're supposed to be scrupulously balanced in terms of not privileging one side over another. And this is grants to those offices. And they bill them as for COVID, so you can buy personal protective equipment for your volunteers and stuff like that. Only 1% of the funding goes to that. The rest of the funding goes to staffing up these operations to drive up mail-in balloting, which, as we talked about, is systematically advantaging Democrat voters. And they have already systematically advantaged Democrat voters by primarily funding Democrat areas in swing states. And so they target registration to Democrat communities, they translate ballots, they design ballots, and ballot design is actually a really, contentious issue. They are...
Well, wait, I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but how does Mark Zuckerberg get to design U.S. government election ballots?
So I think the real answer there is that nobody ever imagined that one of the world's wealthiest people would take over government election offices, so they didn't have a system in place to prevent it. Even in states where people do usually care about election integrity, like Wisconsin, they were shocked when it happened. And like some of the people involved in Wisconsin that are Zuckerberg funded end up driving out the actual government employees from overseeing the election. And they're learning things like where people have already turned in mail-in ballots to know who else to target, which is the kind of information in a partisan campaign you would pay a lot of money for.
Well, yeah.
So technically, maybe not illegal, although it also might be illegal because nonpartisan nonprofit groups aren't supposed to be engaged in such partisan behavior. But frankly, the laws were not up to the situation of what was brought about. And the funding had really serious partisan effects. So in Texas, they analyzed through a complex analysis, Bayesian analysis, that 200,000 additional votes for Biden were received in Texas as a result of this funding. And you think, well, Texas is a pretty red state.
No, it's not at all.
Not at all. And Ted Cruz, I think he won his Senate race by just over 200,000 votes. So it's partly about controlling the outcome in 2020. It's partly about testing things for future elections, or maybe having a greater dominance in future elections. And then a lot of the states that were funded that had much closer margins. Like Georgia's 11,000 votes, and Wisconsin's 20,000, Arizona 10,000. So that type of funding had profound effects on the actual outcome of the election.
It's just so stunning. It's stunning. There are a lot of stunning things going on. This really took my breath away.
Yeah, me too. And there were a lot of states that were funded, but like Florida is a state that's twice the size of Georgia in terms of population. It gets a much smaller amount of funding from these Zuckerberg groups, and it moves 2 points to the right in terms of Donald Trump wins by 1 point in 2016, by 3 points in 2020. Georgia, right across the border, half the population, ends up getting like $45 million of funding, and it moves from a 5-point Trump state to a 1-point Biden state. I mean, they were really smart in how they targeted their funding in Georgia. I mean, it had profound effects.
I'm sorry to say this, but you can see why the people who showed up in Washington on January 6th were mad. I mean, it's not well, an excuse for their criminal behavior, those who committed vandalism, but like, I get it.
Well, yeah, I also oppose political violence in all of its stripes. I mean, that's another thing that gets into play here, too. If you've read the Molly Ball article in Time magazine about the fortification of the election, which is another way of saying the rigging of the election, one of the things that she put in there that I just couldn't believe was that they also had control over their rioters. And the riots of 2020 were also a big part of the story. I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of the Time magazine. The whole Time magazine article is interesting. They call off their rioters on January 6th, which suggested that they were in a level of control there that I don't know if we all realized.
Well, these are militia. This is not rioters. I mean, this is the youth wing of the Democratic Party. I mean, at that point.
And they had engaged in, just a tremendous amount of violence throughout that summer. Dozens of people were killed, attacks on the White House, attacks on federal courthouses, attacks on police precincts, with the support of corporations, the media, prominent members of the Democrat Party. And, that was part of that's part of what we were experiencing in 2020 that I think played a role also.
And the Republican Party did nothing. I mean, how useless are they? Do you think? I mean, this is an ancillary question, but do you think there's some Republican leaders who are actually working for the Democratic Party? I mean, at a certain point, you think if you're that useless, it's probably on purpose, right?
So, and I'm somewhat critical of the Republicans who ostensibly did know what happened in 2020 was a problem in terms of the rioting in the book. But you might remember also that when President Trump does some light enforcement of rule of law following the attack on the White House, and again, just months later, an attack on the Capitol is the worst thing that anyone has ever seen. But we'd all seen the attack on the White House, which included arson and 60 Secret Service officers, or I can't remember which branch they were in, being injured. And he brings out like light law and order to move the fence back. He's falsely accused of being the person who tear gassed these people when it was in fact the D.C. police separately from that operation. And he also gets criticism from Republicans. I mean, it was Mitt Romney, I think, and Senator Sass. They both criticize him for enforcing rule of law. You might remember, was it Tom Cotton goes to the New York Times and talks about the importance of restoring order, and he's attacked by a bunch of people.
Well, they fired the opinion editor at the New York Times, James Bennett, for running that piece.
Yeah, so it's like this horrible situation where the people who should enforce rule of law aren't doing it, but they're also not getting the kind of support that you might hope they would get from other members of the party.
Mitt Romney's like a sad old guy with a lot of bitterness, but like Ben Sass is not stupid at all. But he's got to be working for the Democratic Party on some level, no?
I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know why. Yeah. I don't know why some of the decisions he makes.
You're a nice person. It's such a great point about the rioting, and I have to say, because I can't control myself, as that was happening, geniuses in the White House decide it's the perfect time to push for a jailbreak bill and to start bragging about how we're letting more people out of prison because prison's racist. At exactly the moment when the country is like pretty desperate, people of all colors, for enforcement of existing law, the political operation at the White House decides, no, actually, all of our rich friends are for springing people from prison.
I mean, they had this idea. It was part of their strategy. They, in fact, had quite a bit of success. This is another issue, I think, that Donald Trump is perceived as a threat by the establishment because he is getting so much of the black vote relative to other Republicans. And part of the strategy of getting the black vote for Trump was wrapped up in criminal justice reform, funding for historically black colleges and universities, and massive wage and job growth, which is actually probably the most important thing for black and other minority workers. And so they were holding to that strategy because it was working well for them, but at the expense of a larger strategy, I think.
Yeah. So, okay, Zuckerberg, sorry. It's just nice to have someone who knows all this stuff. I keep having all these questions. Zuckerberg decides basically to buy, I mean, can he do this with the U.S. military too? Could like Mark Zuckerberg decide he wants to own the Marine Corps? I mean, since we're like selling our most basic institutions to billionaires, I guess, apparently.
So we actually do have this problem in multiple different areas with private takeovers of government functions. And you even see it a little bit on the right where nobody's controlling our border, so you have people deciding to take matters into their own hands. So I think this is going to be a big issue going forward. But if you can't protect your elections from one of the world's wealthiest men running them, I mean, that's a huge, you don't really have free and fair and functioning elections.
We're just an oligarchy at that point, right? I mean, that's not a democracy.
They also control our freedom of speech. I mean, you look back to how our founding is so rooted in this idea that we all have the right to pursue the truth wherever that leads. You get freedom of speech, but first and foremost, freedom of religion, right? Huge issue. Then freedom of speech, freedom of the press, all of these other avenues that people use to pursue truth. And these tech oligarchs have decided that we can no longer have these natural rights, or they want to oppose these natural rights that we have. And so they are controlling what we can talk about, when we can talk about it, how we can talk about it, where we can talk about it. It's like a brazen assault on our constitutional freedoms, liberties, and it's a big issue.
On the civilization itself, I would say that's right. So will this continue? I mean, does Zuckerberg continue to run our elections?
So I'm not sure exactly. Some states have already banned it. Some states have strengthened their rules preventing this type of private takeover of government election offices. But also Democrats know it worked out really well for them, so they're fighting the banning of it. So in New York and Wisconsin, Democrat governors understand that this assistance they got from tech oligarchs was huge in some of their victories. And so they are willing to do whatever it takes to keep it going. But you have to wonder, too, like Zuckerberg spent a lot of money to ensure the outcome of the election. And I'm not sure if it was the wisest move on his part in terms of it didn't really keep Democrats from continuing to target him. I think he thought they would be better than Republicans, and that actually is unquestionably true. But he's not being thanked as much as you would think he would be.
No, he's not. And because I think Democrats understand that Facebook is the primary way that Republican voters talk to each other. And they have convinced themselves, and I don't know if this is true, but that without Facebook, Trump never would have been elected.
What they're saying is if people can freely discuss things, then their political opponents win. Now, that there is a way of looking at this on the right. You know, people get so frustrated, and I definitely am one of these people who gets extremely frustrated at this war. But there's a way of looking at it as them being without power, too. Like they're trying to literally control what we talk about it and when because they don't think they can withstand the argument. That's not a position of power that they're in.
No. They're terrified because they know they're illegitimate and they know that their power is slipping away, so they're barking orders. Strong people, I mean, you see this in your own family. If you have dogs, you see it with your dogs. If your dogs respect you, you don't have to yell at them. Do you know what I mean? And when you suspect they don't respect you, that's when you start yelling at them. And same with your kids. So they know that they're illegitimate. That's the problem. But there are plenty of societies, most, in fact, throughout history, where illegitimate leaders...
Oh, yeah. I see people sometimes acting like because that is true, that therefore we don't need to worry too much about the control they have. And you think, well, how did the Soviet Union...
Well, exactly.
There was a lot of people who died for the 70 years that they kept that going. And it was a lot of torture and a lot of loss of artistry and ideas and human flourishing.
Oh, it's the worst thing that ever happened. The single worst. So do you think, bottom line, given the media environment, the changing ways that we were voting, and the takeover of our election system by one rich Democrat, that if we had run the 2020 election like the 2016 election was run, Trump would have been reelected.
I do not even think it's close. I mean, you look at all of the different ways in which votes were manipulated. I mean, even just tech censorship alone, there are studies that indicate that's like millions of votes. The Zuckerberg funding unquestionably played a role in, they primarily funded, or they spent a lot of their money on Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona. Those are 4 states that went for Trump that then end up going for Biden. Like, it was very targeted and smart funding on their part. But if the media hadn't lied brazenly for 5 years, that of course affects the way people think about things. I mean, I think like right now it's interesting to watch people who know they've been lied to. They were told throughout the 2020 election that Trump was incompetent, Republicans are incompetent, and if you put in Joe Biden, we'll have this wonderfully charismatic, articulate, competent leader, and things will be great. And they just look around them and realize like all these people lied. They lied brazenly to us on important issues. I mean, nobody competent is involved in any of our policy, whether it's foreign policy or economic policy, border policy, or the like. And yet, and they downplay the problems that are being caused there. The corporate media downplay the problems that are being caused there. I want to say on this point that many people in America have realized that our corporate media lie. They understand that they are not engaged in honest truth-telling. But there still is a problem where a lot of people who are ostensibly leaders on the right, whether they're elected officials or otherwise, they still talk to these people as if they are operating in good faith or as if they are journalists of some kind.
Or have moral authority.
Yes. And so that is something that just simply needs to stop. Already, corporate media have lost a lot of their trust and credibility, but more needs to happen. And a lot of that relates to, the Republican Party recently had someone who lied for years about the Russia hoax moderate a debate for their gubernatorial election. Like, you can't do that. You can't treat them as if they are in a position of authority that they get to moderate. They have chosen to become activists. That's fine. That's their deal. But don't treat them like they are capable of moderating.
Because they're in their heads. I mean, if you think what the New York Times says matters, if you think getting into Yale is impressive, then you've totally disqualified yourself from wise decision making. Like, I don't respect you. If you really care what the New York Times says about you, if you really want your kid to go to Yale.
So I have the publication, The Federalist, that I helped start a few years ago. And I remember early on someone said that we were dangerous because we didn't care what the New York Times said about us. And I was like, that's exactly right.
But no, you're emancipated because you don't care. I mean, caring is Buddhism is right on this count. Caring ends in suffering. You know what I mean? Like, let go. Who cares? So where does this leave you? So you spend, how long did it take you to write this?
Well, it was done quickly because the election was less than a year ago, but a few months.
You've really marinated in this to a greater extent than anybody. How did it change your views about the American system of democracy?
That's a really good question that I haven't thought enough about.
It's probably good. Maybe that's why you haven't gone crazy.
No, I just knew that right after the election, there was this sense that you weren't allowed to talk about the election, which just was weird because talking about
it wasn't a sense. I think it was a statute.
Yes.
Like, you weren't allowed.
Yeah, and I had already prior to the election been frustrated, by the media and tech, and we didn't even talk about fake polls, which are something that really bothered me before the election. Like, there was a Washington Post ABC poll that said Biden would win by 17 points in Wisconsin, and he won by less than 1%. And it's just like that type of, that wasn't a real poll. So why are we putting it out there? And why do we still listen to these people when they put out other fake polls? All of these things were important to me, but I really just wanted to find out what happened and have the time to look into it and interview people. And I actually found the whole experience to be wonderful because, like, when you're interviewing people for a story like this, you're talking to local lawyers who know the law so well, who understand the details, the nuances of each case, and they told really riveting stories about how the whole operation was done. And so I kind of ended up just being thankful that the country is full of people like this, just people who care about the direction of the country and what to do to save it. And so You can be despairing about the sloppiness of our last election, but you can also think about how great these people are and how our country is full of them and how they largely go unnoticed and they care so much.
Well, it's the third time that you have redirected an answer toward the positive and the hopeful. It says a lot about you. Last question, and I know you've thought a lot about this since you just did an amazing interview, a series of interviews with Trump, which you wrote up for the Federalist, and it was, as I texted you when I read it, the single most accurate description of what Trump is really like that I've ever read, ever. Whatever you think of Trump, you should read Molly Hemingway's description of her conversations with him, because that's what he's actually like. But anyway, why did they hate him so much? Honestly, I'm not quite sure I know the answer. Do you have a theory on that?
I do kind of think it's related to this issue that we have an establishment and there's an ordered way to do things.
Right.
And it's funny that we talk about Russia all the time, because I almost view it like the systematic opposition in Russia, where Putin allows some people who don't share his viewpoint some position of power so he can kind of keep a check on where everybody is. And I think that's what the Republican Party and the conservative movement functioned as for a long time. Like, they were allowed some authority. They were allowed to kind of be this vehicle by which the right portion of the country vents and releases steam, so long as they don't actually have any control over things. And so there were certain roles for this party. They somehow got this party, of all parties, to be the one that was involved in interventionist nation building, which is not part of the Republican Party's foreign policy history. They got to box them in and call them bigoted if they had different policy positions so that they could keep doing things the way they wanted to. And Trump comes in and he just is not playing. I mean, in a way, him not being a Republican, not being a politician, enabled him to break through and sort of show that this was all ridiculous and not serving the needs of the average American worker, certainly not the right half of the country. And so they viewed him as an existential threat because he was an existential threat. And he is, to some extent, still an existential threat. And anyone who follows his approach is a threat to the establishment being able to continue its glorious track record of handling immigration and banking crises and wars and all this. And so anyone who resists them must be stopped. And we saw that they were willing to trade everything to stop him.
Everything. Is he going to run again?
I'm not sure. Like, when I first started interviewing him, I wasn't sure if he would. I kind of got the feeling he would like to not have to do it.
Yeah.
And then the more that people, I think, don't give him credit for what he did do and resist the possibility of him running again, I think the more he's probably inclined to do it.
Could he win?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely think he could. I mean, I'm kind of smart enough to not make predictions after what we went through in 2016.
I think that's a good call.
But, yeah.
Amazing. They just said 1 hour and 3 minutes. That went by so fast. It's unbelievable. But you have a lot to say and a lot of knowledge, and the book is amazing. And you're well deserving of all the accolades it's getting and its sales. Rigged is the name of the book by Molly Hemingway. Molly Hemingway you know very well, but it's even more fun to talk to you at length. Thank you.
Thank you.
Name of the show is Tucker Carlson Today. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We hope as good as this one. We'll see you every weeknight at 8 p.m. on the Fox News Channel.